May I welcome you all to tonight's event on behalf of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute, which hosts tonight's panel discussion on the theme being Bedouin, past and present. It's a great joy to see that we have a full house, that so many people are interested in this topic. We at the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute, we try to, within the broad palette of the topics that we'd like to further, both in our scholarly workshops and conferences, but also in our public presentations, public events, we like to, if you will, sculpt the landscape of our cultural and scholarly activities to such a degree that here and there you have a kind of a mountain or a hill of concentration of events, of topics that have a particular interest to us. And it is clear that natural and cultural heritage are among them. I'm just referring, among other things, that we have organized or co-hosted a large conference on the coral reefs here in the Gulf, very successful conference. And I think we should see tonight's event in a way as belonging to that series of events that have this concentration on natural and cultural heritage. Assistant Professor Nathalie Peutz, who will lead the discussion tonight and who will introduce the speakers, the panel speakers of tonight, is a very valued member of our community, academic community here. She is among the three people who embody spiritually and in another sense our effort to concentrate, to give in another form expression to this concentration of natural and cultural heritage, namely in the area of Arab Crossroads studies. The panel speakers tonight are, in addition to Professor Peutz, Don Chatty, Professor of Anthropology and Forced Migration at the Oxford Department of International Development at the Oxford University, AbdAllah Cole, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology of the American University in Cairo, and Sulayman Khalaf, Anthropologist at the Intangible Heritage Department of the newly created Abu Dhabi Tourism and Cultural Authority. And just to inform you that the format of tonight's presentation is slightly different from what you are what we usually do. Namely, we have, I'm sure that we have in all the four professors, a powerhouse of knowledge and expertise on the subject, and that each of them would be able to fill an entire evening on the subject. But we have asked them to concentrate in individual presentations that all three of them will give on a 12 to 15 minute presentation, and then Professor Peutz will lead the discussion by asking some questions of her own, and that will lead to the discussion of all of you. So please welcome the panelists of tonight.
It is with extraordinary privilege that I further introduce our three panelists this evening. Their research and publications have been of great value not only to the discipline of anthropology more broadly and to its more specific fields of Bedouin, migration, development and conservation, and heritage studies, but also their work has been invaluable with regard to my own research, in which I found myself living with and focusing on Secutran transhuman pastoralists self-identifying as Bedouin. It was thus my great pleasure to have these three anthropologists reflect upon their careers with my students today, and I'm certain that you will find their discussions of their research tonight to be as enlightening and as enjoyable as well. We have with us here, again, starting from my near right, Dr. Sulayman Khalaf, who is a cultural anthropologist originally from Syria, from a Bedouin sheep herding family. Dr. Khalaf is currently working as an expert on intangible cultural and heritage for the Abu Dhabi Tourism and Culture Authority, has taught formally at University of Bahrain, University of Sharjah, and Harvard University, among several distinguished others, and has conducted research in Syria, Kuwait, Egypt, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. Dr. Khalaf has published over 30 articles and chapters on subjects as varied as political change in rural Syria, the evolution of the oil state, globalization and local cultures, migrant workers in the Gulf Arab states, and national identity and heritage revival in the UAE and the Gulf, publishing works on pearl diving, falconry, national dress, heritage villages, and camel racing, among others. Dr. Khalaf is currently completing an ethnography of camel racing in the UAE and was so kind as to guide me through the camel races in Al-Watba recently with his ethnographic eye for detail. Dr. Don Chatty, sitting in the middle, is a social anthropologist also of Syrian and US background, is currently a professor of anthropology and forced migration and director of the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford University. Dr. Chatty has conducted research in Syria, Lebanon, and Oman, and on refugees from Palestine, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Western Sahara, as well as on the expulsion and displacement of several other Middle Eastern peoples. Her books include Dispossession and Displacement in the Modern Middle East, Mobile Pastoralists, Development Planning and Social Change in Oman, which has recently been translated into Arabic, and the edited volumes Conservation and Mobile Indigenous Peoples, Displacement for Settlement and Sustainable Development, Children of Palestine Experiencing Forced Migration in the Middle East, and Nomadic Societies of the Middle East and North Africa Facing the 21st, Entering the 21st Century, right? Dr. Chatty's research interests include nomadic pastoralism and conservation, gender and development, health, illness and culture, children and adolescents and prolonged conflict and forced migration, and development-induced displacement. Dr. Chatty has also worked for development agencies such as the UNDP, UNICEF, FAO, FIAD, and USAID, and is affiliated with projects such as Nomadic Peoples, Nomads in Oman, Bedouin Health, and the Dana Declaration on Mobile Peoples and Conservation. Third but not last, Dr. AbdAllah Cole is originally from the Texan Gulf, the Gulf of Mexico area, is a social anthropologist and professor emeritus at the American University in Cairo, where he has worked from 1971 to 2007. Dr. Cole has conducted research in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt among both Bedouin communities, the Al-Mora Bedouin and the Awlad Ali Bedouin, respectively, and settled communities. Dr. Cole's books include Bedouin, Settlers, and Holidaymakers, Egypt's Changing Northwest Coast, Arabian Oasis City, The Transformation of Uneza, and Nomads of the Nomads, the Al-Mora Bedouin of the Empty Quarter, which was recently reprinted in 2010 as Bedouins of the Empty Quarter. Dr. Cole's Arabian Oasis City happens to have been the first ethnography I ever read, long before I turned my own sights to anthropology, so it's a double pleasure to have him sitting here and to have him come to my class today. He has also written several seminal articles and chapters on Bedouin and has worked also with the World Bank, Kuwait Institute of Scientific Research, the International Development Center, and the AUC Social and Desert Development Center, among others. Again, it is with great pleasure to welcome each one of you here to NYU Abu Dhabi. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by saying how delighted and honored I am to be invited for this panel. And I'd like to thank New York University, Abu Dhabi twice for having this wonderful idea of a panel discussion on the Bedouins, past and present, and also for bringing three old friends together, whom I haven't seen for quite a while. My short presentation today is on the changing Bedouin culture, and I have taken one particular example of it, camel racing in the UAE. I'm addressing the situation of modern Bedouin culture in the Emirates in particular, but by extension to the wider Gulf through the lens of a particular element of cultural heritage, that of camel racing. Though the focus here is on a particular element, many of the analytical points can be extrapolated to other aspects of modern Bedouin life. The Bedouins of Arabia used to perceive the pattern of their pastoral life as something always changing. They viewed their world as precarious and unpredictable, which is captured in their saying, "Dunyak مثل الغيم عجل زوالها." Ye man, your world is like clouds, swiftly changing. It is no surprise that they looked to the sky in search of good pastures for their camel herds and their own well-being. They never thought that one day they would be showered from plenty of good from underground. The dawn of the great transformation of the Bedouin world is pictured for us by Abdurrahman Munif in his novel Mudun al-Milh, cities of salt. One day, he says, in the first novel of the five-volume novel, one day a Bedouin emir stood among his fellow tribesmen of Wadi al-Uyun and said to them, O ye Ibn Rashid, there are here under our feet seas of oil, seas of gold, and Al-Khawiyya, the oil company people, have come to dig out the oil and the gold. The Emir went on to say, Oh, you will be the richest and happiest of all people, as if Allah sees nobody but you. You have been patient for long, Allah is witness to that. But now you will be living in a new life as if in a dream. You will talk about your old days as if they were just stories to be told. Since the discovery of oil, the people of the Arabian Gulf have undergone rapid and profound transformations during their own lifetime, so much so that now they indeed talk about old times as if they were only stories to be told. Transformations generated by the oil economy have led to the collapse of the traditional economic activities like pearling, seaborne trade, and pastoralism. During the initial stages of the black gold rush, from the 60s to the late 70s, the camel and its desert ecology were neglected and marginalized. The expanding oil cities drew like powerful magnets the Bedouin, who were always ready to move to greener pastures. They settled in newly expanding towns and cities to enjoy the comforts of an affluent, sedentary consumer life, with extensive free welfare services and provisions. Within the new economic context, many of the previous benefits and uses of the camel, which were essential to the Bedouin pastoral way of life, rapidly disappeared. The camel, that once was known among the Arabs as Safinatul Sahara, ship of the desert, retired from sailing across the desert sand dunes and now gets carried on wheels. However, the rapid marginalization of camel culture experienced during the early decades of the oil boom came to be halted. This is because there was an increasing realization of the importance of preserving traditional culture. The camel in general, and racing camels in particular, came to be in the thick of this cultural revived phenomenon. Racing camels, known locally as al-Hijn, are returning in large numbers, carried by trucks from near and far throughout the Gulf to the large racetracks built nowadays near most major cities. Over the last 3 decades, this heritage sport has grown in huge ways. It's almost a national cultural industry. It is now organized annually for about 6 months in individual emirates, also at the national level, and also at the level of the wider Gulf region, primarily UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. To provide a meaningful analytical answer to the question as to why camel racing is now being practiced on such a large scale requires that we go beyond the races and heritage revival as such and contextualize them within the broader ongoing processes of oil economy, the building of a modern nation state, increasing global forces acting on the local culture, and the issue of national cultural identity. In pre-oil times, camel races were performed occasionally on festive social occasions and celebrated by small communities as something woven within the local community in an organic manner. When a sheikh visited them during the Eids, during circumcision rituals, and the like. Nowadays, the scope and depth of change has touched all aspects of camel races, so much so that they now appear beyond recognition for many of the elderly Bedouins. These modern developments can be delineated by an analytical description of the different interrelated aspects which make up this revived heritage sport. These various aspects include the media, the new organizational developments or innovations, economic, political, cultural aspects, as well as aspects related to the interplay between local and global forces. First, media or mass media, represented by television, radio, newspapers, and magazines, is one of the leading agencies involved in the production and propagation of heritage activities, such as camel racing and other heritage festivals in the UAE society. Television in particular has played a significant role in the evolution and popularization of this cultural sport. It has been the medium and the message, as Marshall McLuhan would put it. As far the organizational aspects which have produced camel racing as something like invented tradition, these are numerous actually, and I'll be touching on only a few of them. The establishment of Camel Racing Association with branches in the various Emirates. It is the overall organizational umbrella. The building of camel racetracks on the outskirts of all major cities and even small towns. The introduction of different races for different breeds of Hijan. The introduction of different distances for various camel age groups. Trading and feeding of the racing camels, all changed in very big ways. And finally, providing modern vet medical care for them. Stationary and mobile hospitals. As for the economic aspects that one can look at with regard to the races, I actually was intrigued by an idea that was formulated by an old Canadian or American anthropologist, Louise Sweet. She talked about the old tradition of camel raiding in Arabia, and she analyzed it as a way of distributing camel wealth among the Bedouin groups. It was simply a mechanism of ecological adaptation. So, stretching this line of argument, I look at present-day camel racetracks as an arena where the Bedouin tribesmen bring their camels to race and reach out to the bounty of the oil welfare state. So this is a very strong economic factor. With regard to the economic aspect, we have cash and cars, gilded swords and daggers. We have salaries and wages. We have camel markets. We have marketing and advertising. That's for the economic aspect of the races. It's a huge area by itself, and I could dwell on it for hours, but I'm just giving you these little points as a shorthand. With regard to the political and cultural aspects, all of these aspects are actually strongly interrelated. The UAE, as an imagined community, rests on certain heritage foundations, among which camel culture occupies a central position. The invention of camel culture provides a link to the historical nomadic way of life that has been swept away by modernization. The races help the younger generation learn about how their ancestors lived and struggled. Also, camel racetracks provide the Emirati community with a ritually constructed theater to celebrate its own specific political ideology, cultural traditions, and values by invoking a set of nationalistic themes, symbols, metaphors, and language. Framing these cultural celebrations with Bedouin poetics and cultural aesthetics provide a voice to the Bedouin changing culture. This gives a generalized support to national identity, which is currently perceived as seriously threatened by shifting and powerful global forces. The invention of camel traditions aim at safeguarding cultural heritage and national identity, as well as the traditional political structure of UAE as a modernizing nation state. These themes that are expressed repeatedly in the Bedouin poems recited during the races include, first, praising the ruling sheikhs and modern development of the UAE, since the sheikhs are the patron of this big phenomenon of camel racing revival. They call it إحياء التراث وتراثة الرياضة التراثية, the heritage sport. The second theme, praising the camels in action and also praising their trainers, al-mudammirin. Third, the third theme, invoking and praising traditional Bedouin desert tribal values, chivalry writ large. Fourth, emphasizing cultural integrity and identity of the modern nation state. Now I turn to the last aspect of the races, the local global aspects of camel racing culture. And here we can actually see what you may call few contradictions or ironies in the whole process. Paradoxically, the same oil wealth that initially led to the collapse of the Bedouin pastoral life and culture has been the empowering factor behind the heritage revival in the UAE, including camel racing as an invented tradition, as Eric Hobsbawm called it. Point two, the revitalization of camel heritage has required the assistance of modern global commodities and technologies, oil, the car, and television, each generating its own cultural dynamics and thus reshaping camel culture. Third, the commercialization of camel traditions is due to the financial support of the sheikhs, the car agents who function as interlocutors between the global business and local markets, and the economic empowerment of high consumerism in society. However, this commercial aspect is functionally useful for reproducing and sustaining this new camel culture. Production of culture requires both political and cultural economies. The media emphasizes the labor and roles provided by the local Emeritus and their ruling elite, but marginalizes the contribution from other global actors who are actually involved in the production of the races at every stage. Currently, it's estimated that there are more than 120 people involved in the production of the annual camel races, which usually last about 6 months of the year, start in October and they end in late March. By March, represent the finales. So I would say the majority of all those 120 plus are global actors coming from Asia, Sudan, and the like. The races involve both local and global actors and agents from many different nationalities with different social and professional positions: sheikhs, merchants, tribesmen, foreign experts, and the shepherds and laborers. This generates hierarchies, disparities, and particular power economic relations. Though this is a reflection of the modern global local dynamics worldwide. This is seen in other domains as well. My last comments relate to what does the future hold for the Bedouin camel culture in the Emirates. And I have 4 brief points on this. One can think of several actually, but with the pressure of time. The present-day production of camel culture is far removed from the traditional nomadic pastoral mode of life, where tribal lineage groups migrated together with their camels and camped together. Nowadays, most Bedouins involved in camel breeding or organizing camel-based activities relate to the camels as owners and managers and drive their air-conditioned 4-wheel drive cars to spend an hour or two with their hired camel laborers from Asia and Sudan. Kind of a new camel proletariat emerged in Arabia. As camel owners, they are now divorced from the very practice or praxis demanded by the material life conditions that in the past produced pastoral traditional Bedouin culture. We can anticipate, in view of this, and many other things that I have no time to actually dwell on, we can anticipate that the pastoral nomadic camel culture will be so reduced to a historical cultural memory that will call for further safeguarding by state institutional interventions. The elderly Bedouin nomads are fast disappearing, and their culture along with them. However, invented Bedouin camel culture or traditions, such as camel racing, the Mizaina or camel beauty contest that are held annually in the western region in Ad-Dafra to celebrate the beautiful things about camels, not only from the United Arab Emirates, but from the Gulf at large, bringing more than 20,000 camels every year. The Million Street, where camels are bought and sold, they called it the Million Street, as a takeoff from the Million Poet program, and the TV heritage programs. All of these will continue to constitute an important and visible cultural scene in Arabia. And that's what we are having now, and it will be changing in the future as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, I must first start by thanking Sulayman for stopping at just the right point for what I want to do next. When Nathalie wrote and invited us to come, she put forward a question: what does it mean to be Bedouin, and how has it changed over 50 years? Well, I can't quite talk about 50 years ago, but I can just about talk about 40 years ago, when I was beginning my doctoral research. And one of the themes that I think has followed me throughout my career and my work has always been either the statement or the question, when are the Bedouin going to disappear? Or, there aren't any more Bedouin around, are there? So I thought I would start, actually use up 4.5 very important minutes by showing you a video clip which my son took for me in January when I went out to visit a family who I've known for 30 years, who I've worked with in the Harasis, in the Jid al-Harasis in Oman. And I was lucky to be there at a time when the family wanted to move their herd of about 200 camels from an area around Nimr north to Khamkham, which is quite a long distance, and they also had to find a way around a rather large oil installation. So if we're ready, I would like to start to show the clip. Are we ready? I hope that wasn't too much of bringing coals to Newcastle. It was meant to refute the statement that there aren't any more camel nomads in Arabia. I'm not going to say that it's alive and kicking in the same way that it was 50 years ago or 40 years ago, but if you agree with me as an anthropologist that cultures always change, and nomadic pastoral culture has also changed, and it continues to change, it continues to adapt, then we're probably on the same page. I hope that this video clip was going to raise a few questions in your mind which might be addressed at the end. One of the questions which maybe some of you will want to be asking is, how come the cars are so new? There were a few older trucks and water bowsers, but the cars are very new. Why weren't there any women there other than the anthropologist and her daughter? And what's an oil installation doing in the middle of one of the most important grazing areas for this particular tribe, but also for other tribes? There are other questions that you might ask, but I think these questions also speak to what's happened to the Bedouin and what does it mean to be Bedouin today. This morning, AbdAllah and Sulayman and I met with students, and one of the questions which we addressed, well, we didn't mean to address, because we basically were talking about how we came to anthropology, but the question that arose is, what does it mean to be a Bedouin? What is a Bedouin? And I think this is a problem. It is a term that has a very broad generic use, and it also has a very specific use. And if I talk about my own research, which began in Syria and Lebanon, and then moved to Oman, 40 years ago, if I said Bedouin, people understood what I meant. And I worked with a group of herders who considered themselves Bedouin. In fact, they considered themselves formerly noble Bedouin, part of the Aneza Confederation of Tribes of Northern Arabia. But I also worked with another group who were adjacent to them, and some might say in a patron-client relationship with them, who were sheep herders, but they had been in Syria since at least the 13th century. And they considered themselves Bedouin at the time. When I came to Oman, the term Bedouin wasn't applied systematically. People didn't talk about Bedouin in the deserts of Oman, certainly not in the 1980s. The various communities who I worked with talked about themselves as being of the Harasis or the Janaba or the Duru and so on. So they talked about themselves as being part of a community with very strong group solidarity. But over time, certainly in Oman, the term Bedouin has been adopted, and it's been applied to herders in the interior. Interestingly enough, it's also been applied to fishing communities. So I've heard the term Bedou fishermen, which initially I found very strange, because I had grown up with the idea that Bedou was a term derived from the word Badia, which is semi-arid or desert land, and that the Bedou were the people who lived in the Badia. Some of them were camel herders, some of them were sheep herders, and then, according to Ibn Khaldun, they were also beekeepers. Many other professions, or I should say occupations as well. What interested me about spending a little bit of time with this term is that recently I was back in Lebanon and Syria and working with the community that I had first worked with in the 1970s. The group that had moved into Lebanon and was doing some herding, but basically had moved into agriculture, didn't like my calling them Bedouin. They insisted that they were tribal, not Qaba'ili, but they were Asha'iri. They were tribal people. They found the term Bedouin derogatory, and they asked me not to use it, which I was happy to comply. In Syria, I then was a little bit worried whether I could use the term Bedouin or not. What term did I have to use? So I asked some of the Bedouin I had worked with earlier, what do you like to be called? And of course, those from the Aneza tribe said, we are Bedouin. And I said, but what about the term Arab? Because in Lebanon, that's what they prefer us to use. They said, no. Arab were sheep herders, and now they do a great deal of seasonal agricultural work. So there are many different terms using, but I think as a shorthand, we recognize Bedouin, or Bedou as being people of the desert, and there being also a desert culture. In the early part of the 1970s into the 1980s, there was a fixation on another term attached to the term Bedouin, and that was the term nomad. So people talked about nomads, and pure nomads, and semi-nomads, and semi-settled, and then the settled. And this is a term that I've always tried to avoid. It's a term which I believe was introduced at the end of World War I, at the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, introduced by the French and the British as they set about modernizing this part of the world. And it is a term which suggests that there's something backward about being nomadic. So I've constantly avoided using that term, but I think you still find the sense that nomads, or people who move, are somehow less sophisticated than those who are settled. And that particular term is why I've avoided it altogether. And so my most recent work talks about mobile pastoralists. That's suggesting that, of course, there could be some settlement. Perhaps the family, the elderly, the children in school are in a village most of the year, but some of the men who aren't working in lucrative employment are herding. But then, of course, there's also now the introduction of hired herders, very often from Baluchistan or from Sindh. This is not to suggest that a way of life is necessarily dying out, but as I said earlier, it's a way of life that is changing. But I would still maintain that the basic culture, the importance of what I'm going to call solidarity based on kinship, or asabiya, if you want to use an old term, is very important. And this is the kinship. Whether you want to talk about segmentary lineages, I'm sure you've all heard the expression that somehow for some sounds as though it's an Orientalist trope, but I against my brother, I and my brother against my cousins, I, my brother, my cousins against the world. This is the expression of segmentary lineage organization, which I have to say exists today. It's been modified, but working in the Bekaa Valley last summer, I was very surprised to find a certain group of young men refused to cross a road because there had been a blood feud and there hadn't yet been a settlement, and it wasn't their family that had been involved, but a family that was part of their lineage. So this may sound as though it's an Orientalist trope, but it's very much in existence today. On the positive side, this is what really strengthens and gives coherence to those people in the deserts who we greatly admire, but at the same time we recognize there is this pejorative sense about the meaning of Bedouin. I'm a little bit worried. I know I've got to stop after 15 minutes, but can I just say a little bit that actually just really reinforces Sulayman's point? The modernization paradigm, which has been part of this area for the last 50 years or so, I think did set up an opposition of Bedouin somehow as being backward and irrational, with a lot of settlement projects. That's basically how I came to start studying forced settlement and then forced migration. Many of these projects to settle Bedouin failed, resulting in impoverished herding in some areas, land often taken over for conservation projects, access to other areas of land lost for oil projects. But throughout all these ups and downs, there is a cultural revival taking place, which I think we should celebrate. And this Bedouin heritage, or this reawakening, even though I think has probably emerged out of tourism or ecotourism, as AbdAllah Cole has written about, I think has helped to reinforce the importance of Bedouin culture. We can talk about some of its main features later on, but I think I'll just end here to say it's a way of life that's adapting. It's its survival has always required that kind of adaptation from deficit to surplus, and now it's expressed through multi-resource economies, through camel racing and some of the purses which emerge, through employment in the police and the army, and of course through other occupations. So I'll stop here, and hopefully we'll have some discussion at the end.
Back in 1968, 1388 Hijrah, I had the great fortune to arrive in Riyadh in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It was a very different world back then. That was some 44 years ago. It was a very different world in Saudi Arabia. There were almost no non-Saudis in the whole country. There were a few people at Aramco, some Egyptian members of the Muslim Brotherhood who were in exile from Egypt, some Syrian doctors. Other than that, a few Pakistani doctors and so forth. All work was done in Saudi Arabia, manual work and so forth, was done by Saudis. The government was run by Saudis. The companies, all that were there, had Saudis. It was totally local. I don't know what things were like here, because those were the days where the British were still here, and my cousins would not allow us to come into this part of the world, but I think it was probably something similar. Those were, for me, I've considered that I was extremely lucky to be able to go to Saudi Arabia at that time. Oil, of course, had been on the agenda in Saudi Arabia since about 1938, when it was first discovered. Yet, there was not much that had developed aside from some minor production. It was only in 1973-74, some 5 or 6 years after I was in Saudi Arabia, that oil began to be making a significant impact in the economy, and then ultimately in the society, and bringing about many changes. I was doing my dissertation, field research in anthropology from the University of California at Berkeley. And I had the great fortune to be able to go and to spend 18 months, a year and a half, with camel nomads, Bedouin, if you will, in the empty quarter, some 400 or 500 kilometers south of Al-Hassa, which I don't know with the map. It's probably more or less west of here. This was with the Al-Murra tribe, who were then, in those days, one of the most highly nomadic communities, mobile communities within the peninsula. They were camel herders. The camels that they had were of the finest quality, not just because I said so, but because they were beautiful, very large beasts, mujahim, the black milk camels. We also had hijn from Bataniya and from Oman that were raised by these people. The group that I was with, and which were more or less typical of the Al-Murra at that time, and of other tribes throughout the peninsula, lived in extended family households. One of the things that defined people was that they were the men and the women, the old and the young, were all together in one household, one Beit Sha'ar. Not just a tent. A tent carries a different meaning. Al-Khema is something that refugees lived in, not what Bedouin lived in. Bedouin lived in hare houses that had been made by the senior woman, the grandmother, so to speak, of the family. She had made it, and it was hers. Milkha. It was her property. If her husband decided to divorce her for whatever reason, she took her tent, or she kept her tent, and he had to go and find someplace else to stay. And that happened even amongst the emirs, amongst the sheikhs of the family. I could tell stories, but maybe don't need to go into them. But very much the household was the domain of women. Inside the household, one 3/4 of the tent, more or less, of the Beit Shar was for the women's side. One side was for the men, where the men had their coffee fire, and the coffee fire was very much a part of the identity of the people, of where the guest came. A man coming to visit, you came in, salamu alaikum, wa alaikum salam, and coffee was immediately, would be brewed, would be pounded, would be brewed. You went through the whole sort of thing. We went through that daily, many times every day. Each one of these households was closely linked to others in a lineage. And we were, the group that I was with, about 35 households, and each household, I should say, equaled a herd of camels. All those went together, a household, a family household, and a herd of camels. We were 35 in the group of people who were descended from a common ancestor about 5 generations earlier. During the summertime, the waqt al-Gid, when people were settled around a permanent source of water, maybe 20 of those households would be there, sometimes 25, 30, depending on whatever, because you had to be, during the hot summer months, the camels had to be at permanent source of water. They would drink water every 4 days. The water had to be pulled from the wells, the sawani pulled from the wells with the camels, and the ones who rode the camels that pulled the water back in front were young girls, young women, beautiful, and the young men were happy to see them. They played an active role in drawing the water out of the tent. The water was then poured into great buckets, and the camels would drink, and then they would go off on their own for 3 or 4 days, wandering on their own, and they would then come back to that well on their own to drink during the summer. As the days got cooler and the sun was in September, October, we would begin to look to the north to see if there was any signs of lightning. If there had been lightning, that might mean that there was rain. If there were people traveling, you would ask them, what's your news? And what is the news that you wanted to hear was, what is the news of al-haya, of life. Life was what they called the word for rain. And these people were very empirical. Not just what news can you tell us about there, because anybody would like to give you good news. They say, how did you get that news, that information? Did you see it? No, I heard it from who? So-and-so. And who heard it from so-and-so? And they would ask them, and did you, how much was it? And you measured the rain by how far it penetrated into the sand. So was it just this much, or was it this much? And who else is there? Because you had to gather all of this information about who was where in the desert. And mind you, this was when there were no cell phones, no means of communicating with anybody, and so forth. You gather this information, and then as in October, November, as the information came, we would begin to migrate to the north. And there would be literally hundreds, even tens of thousands of camels moving out of the empty quarter, out of the Rub al-Khali, more or less west of where we are here, going north. And crossing the road, the highway, and so forth. There would be hundreds of between Riyadh and Dammam. You would see thousands of camels moving north as they moved up into the areas of Wadi al-Ajman or towards Havr al-Batan in the north of on the borders of Kuwait, or even sometimes going into Iraq. The borders of countries were not important. The Arab were this was their territories, and they went in the field. Then in spring, we drifted back as as it got warmer and warmer after the winter and spring. People would drift back to their wells. Now camels are something incredible, and our camels were, of course, the best in the world. They really were, I think, and they had genealogies that went back. The camel could find his or her way all the way back to their well. So the Bedouins say, we can't leave them. Even if we wanted to go and live somewhere else or settle them, we have to follow them. And there was this close relationship between the Ebel the camels, and the Bani Adam, and the people. That was very, very, they loved them, and the camels were, and there was a very, I don't want to romanticize it and so forth, but it really was true. They played a very extremely important role in that way. That was going on, and this was what defined, in those days, this was what defined the Badia. That you were skilled herders of camels in particular. There were also, in Saudi Arabia in those days, people who herded sheep and goats. Almost never camels and sheep and goats together. They were always either you herded camels or you herded sheep and goats. The sheep and goat people tended to move also, but relatively not too often, shorter distances and so forth. But modern transportation was coming onto the scene. And so there were beginning to be big Mercedes trucks, and news would come that rains had fallen in such and such an area, and it was quite common for people then, those people who were those kinds of herders, to put the sheep and goats onto the truck. The women sitting up high above, you often, and move very quickly to where the rains had fallen. This was going on, and still, I guess, goes on. Interestingly, sometimes the trucks were driven by women. The people who say that women don't drive in Saudi Arabia have never been in the desert. The Bedouin women drive no problem, and nobody would dare to stop them. Yeah. These were important aspects of what it meant to be Bedouin. A lot of that has disappeared and is gone in some ways, but those are memories that are not that far in the past. I would say that also another thing that it meant to be Bedouin for the people themselves was early marriage. For both men, both boys, both males and females. When a male had a beard, it was time for him to be married, and he would be married, and to usually, preferably, bint am. Ibn am, bint am, parallel cousin marriages were very common. And they took place when they were young, and or if they were not bint am, ibn am, they were close family relatives and so forth. This was something that they were extremely proud of. This was something that identified them as being asliin, of being pure, of being proud, of following the customs of Arab al-Ariba. The Arabs of the Arabs, not the Arab al-Mustarab, like you people, maybe. These were, and I'm not, making this up. This was part of the talk that they taught me about. Whatever I know about the Bedouin, I was taught it by them in the course of doing field work and living with them during those years that I did. The camels were especially important to them because of their milk. And milk was a major item in their diet. We drank huge amounts of milk all the time, and it was very, very good. There also was, we had to have other food. You can't live totally on milk. You have to have access to agricultural products, especially to some kind of wheat or rice in those days we had. We would sometimes kill a rabbit, and meat was not a regular thing in anybody's diet or anything like that. But people were healthy. The first 4 or 5 years of a person's life was dangerous. There was high infant mortality. But after those first 4 or 5 years, people seemed to live extremely long lives. Nobody was overweight. Nobody was underweight. There was no sukkar. No, what do you call sukkar? This was a character, and the people themselves, the people of that generation, I know, they all talk about it. Wallahi sahih. There was none of this was something. This is what modernization brought us. Instead of it brought these kinds of things. They were also highly skilled people in the desert. They could, the Al-Murra, of course, are famous or infamous even for being trackers, because they tracked people and even worked, some of them worked for the police and so forth, and tracked thieves and whatever. But they could track, well, we could recognize if these were our camels, or if these were the camels of somebody else, or if this was a woman who was walking, whether she was pregnant and which woman she was and whatever. These were things, it's not, I mean, I'm not making it up. These are not just stories. I saw all of that sort of thing. That kind of knowledge was there, that other people didn't have, which was something that was typical of the Bedouin, al-Badia. Those people who lived in villages, of course, did not know that. People ask me now, how come the Al-Murra were such famous trackers? And of course, the Al-Murra was sometimes would say this is because yani jinn, things like that, to try to keep people away from them, make them maybe be afraid and sort of, But because they learned it, they taught it to their children. They were living in the sands. The Rub al-Khali is also called al-Ramla, al-Rimal, the sands. In the sands, you live there in the large, not all of it's sands, but I mean parts of it. You're very much aware of footprints, and the characteristics of people, and they notice people's feet. Something that I've learned from them. And you look and you think that all feet look alike. Turns out that no, there is difference. They were very empirical, because their life depended on knowing where to go, of having water. We were living a dangerous life in some sense. You had to protect. Ibn Saud the government was very remote. And the government was also seen in those days as largely personified in the ruler. If you were in Western Arabia or in Central Arabia, the government was Ibn Saud. For us, Al-Murra in the Eastern Arabia, it was Ibn Jalui. Ibn Jalui was the cousin of Abdulaziz, but very, very, very powerful. So the Dawla was remote from them. People often talk about the Bedouin as being remote from the Dawla, from the state. Well, they saw that the Dawla was far away, like this type. They were also, I would say, somewhat suspicious of foreigners, of outsiders. They didn't know foreigners. They were not happy with some of the things that they saw amongst people in Aramco and whatever. There were stories, and it was some kinds of those were some kind of problems that existed there. We had no radios. There was very little news or knowledge about the outside world. People ask me, America, where is America? Somewhere behind Kuwait. We laugh today, but I mean, people in America had no idea whatsoever where Saudi Arabia was, and they still don't. Those kinds of things, it was a very exciting sort of period. Now, in the 50s, in the 1950s, 1960s, increasingly, during the period that I was there, some people from the Bedouin communities of Arabia, when I say Arabia, I mean Saudi Arabia, began to take on jobs in the oil companies or in some other kinds of activities, or they became members of the Haras al-Watani, of the National Guard in Saudi Arabia. A number of these people began to settle. They were poor, like everybody in Saudi Arabia in the 50s and 60s. Even the princes, compared to what they are, were rather poor by many standards, and their living standards and so on. These people lived in shanty towns around Al-Hassa, for example, the ones that I knew, or around Abqaiq, or around Rasta Noura, or around Dammam in eastern Saudi Arabia or outside of Riyadh. And we looked down on these people, because I was with the camel nomads. We looked about these people, they are so mesquine, poor. They don't have any milk to drink, these people. They're really bad. And they were. It was not a pleasant sort of thing. But what was happening was that their sons were going to school. not good schools, but schools. At any rate, they were beginning to learn and to become literate, and many of them were working at low, as kuliya, as they were called, coolies, working for the oil company. This was the term that was used for the unskilled workers and so forth. And these people socially were Bedouin and so forth, but they were not herding camels. They were not in the desert anymore. So were they really Bedouin? Not in the sense of being herders of animals, as herders of camels, but socially they were part of the same identity. We married from them, and in fact they went sometimes and lived in the desert, and there were complex stories. It's not just a one-way sort of street that went on. Now, if we fast forward to today, 40, 50 years later, there are huge herds of camels in Saudi Arabia and of sheep and goats. But these herds of camels and the sheep and goats are no longer herded by their owners. Before, their owners herded them, or the sons of the owners herded them, and the women. Now, the herders are Sudanese, Yemenis, come from Nepal, come from other places, are hired herders. Just like if you have a mezra, a farm in Saudi Arabia, the worker there is not yourself or your brother or your son or your daughter, but somebody from, I don't know, Egypt, wherever, hired herders and so forth. That is the situation now. The camels that are raised are no longer dependent on the natural graze and browse of the desert, but are dependent now almost 90% on fodder. Grown in plots in the desert. It's become commercialized. You go and it's expensive now. Money was not part of the past. It depended on nature. You needed to know where were the rains and where the grasses were and where to take them and so forth. Now the younger generation doesn't do that. They go and buy fodder, put it in their trucks. They deal with a Pakistani who's dealing with them and so forth, and they don't speak the language, but they know how to make the deals and whatever, and the camels eat this. People tell me that this is not good for the camels. I don't know, maybe it isn't. But why do they have these camels? They raise them in partly because they are theirs. The camels are there. What are you going to do with them? You can't just abandon them, So you have to look after them and so forth. They're also raised for sale by the former Bedouin or nomads or whatever in say Saudi Arabia. Raise them, especially the purebred ones, very fine quality camels are raised for sale abroad. And I understand recently was told that people here in Abu Dhabi, Diniyas, for example, are a wonderful source of income for the Bedouin in Saudi Arabia because they liked the camels that are raised in the empty quarter, especially, are very, very fine quality camels, and they are prized here, and people here, alhamdulillah, have money and are able to purchase them, and sometimes you have them a million riyals, 3 million riyals is not unheard of. For more common is 100,000, 200,000 sort of riyals for these things. It's a significant source of money, of income. People buy them, and they themselves also buy them and keep them for investment. Bedouin are investing in so this was also an interesting thing several years. You mentioned I worked for the Kuwait Institute of Scientific Research, and one of the issues that was there was that the Qabail, the Bedouin around Kuwait, were relatively poor, but they could afford, if they had some savings, what did they do with it? It was not enough to really make a big investment in the modern economy, but they could invest in buying some sheep. And the sheep would usually bring more sheep. And you bring all of this, and of course, this is halal, very halal. Mafi riba. Of course, you take you might lose the sheep if there's no a war comes along or whatever. But anyway, it's a good investment. Also, they're kept, as I would say, as heirlooms for some people. Some people, they are ours, they are part of us, and these are things, and simply for pleasure. One of the son of a man who worked as a driver for Aramco in back in the 60s when I was there, now owns a very, very big, or several big companies. He has a herd of camels that he has a relative keep with him, so that he just goes to visit them on the weekend for pleasure, shan bistanis, to be with them, as like others go to the seacoast or go to do something or have a boat or whatever. He likes to go to the desert. So most of them are settled there now. The women are, as I think somebody mentioned, the women largely are not too much in the desert. They are in settled communities, dispersed, not in cities usually. The men often now working in modern occupations, they go to visit the camels on the weekend. It sometimes is costly to them, but they keep it up. It's part of a complex process of change that is going on, but they didn't suddenly cease to be members of their, with ties to their past. So, what does it mean to be Bedouin today? It's a question that we've asked again and again. I think this, and I wrote here that this is more a question that anthropologists raise and other people ask about. It's not something the older Bedouin that I know, or the younger sons and grandsons, I don't know the granddaughters and daughters very much. It's not something that they ask. Are we Bedouin? Are we not Bedouin? I mean, I don't know. It's an empirical question. We should go and ask them instead of maybe sitting around talking to them. What is important, the younger generation, the ones that they are more likely, I'm guessing, because I haven't really studied this, but there's more of a sort of an interest in al-qabila, a tie to the tribe, but not to the small fakhad, or the small lineage from before, but more generally. Of the younger generation, they are aware of so and so. These are from such and such. They know, and they know the genealogies. It's mentioned and talked about and so forth. And they keep in contact with each other. Even now, I have some friends of them on Facebook, friends who are from the same small lineage that I lived with. A couple of them are in Britain, in Great Britain, in studying in the United Kingdom. Some others are in Colorado studies. Some others are somewhere else. And they're all sort of, it's a kind of a group of people from our fakhad. Keeping in contact with each other and sending pictures around and so forth. And the identity, the ties are there, the social there. What is also important, I would say, to these modern Bedouin, if you call them that way, or postmodern Bedouinism, the things that are important to them are citizenship. The Saudi Bedouin are very conscious of being Saudi. I don't know about here. I mean, they stress that. I assume they're also very much that we are Arab. We are Arabs. Also, Islam is very important in the identity. They may not pray all the time. I know, in fact, they argue back and forth. Did you pray Salat al-Jum'ah? La, ya Allah hadik. It's something that it happens. It's going on, and things. They are also interested in football. They're interested in girls, in hanging out, in camel beauty contests that you talked about. They love to go to the camel races, and they watch it, and they are aware of it, and so forth and so on. They're interested in sport, recreation. They also have a tie to al-amna, to security. which is a traditional thing of the Badia, of at least of Saudi Arabia, who were part of the security structures of the kingdom. They have, as younger ones, often served in security forces and of the kingdom. They are part of the elite, I guess you could say. So, I don't think we need to worry about them. They're not going to, disappear. They are changing. I grew up in Texas as, we were Texas Bedouin. We were cattlemen, my family, and so forth. I'm not a cattleman. But when I go home and there are rodeos, I can feel what it is. I know about it. It's not something strange, and I enjoy it. Even when, I visit with my relatives, and they are looking at all the sort of people men riding bulls, which is really quite weird. But I can understand it. It's something that's there. I mean, it's a part of the culture. So. It's an issue that I think that we live today in a post-Bedouin society, I guess you could say, and in a post-modern world. Yet there's continuity, there's change, and more concern might be today about the role of what's happening to the deserts, not due to the Bedouin. What's happening to the range and the camels themselves and that whole thing. It's a huge camel market. I just noticed the other day in Riyadh. I came from Riyadh the other day. And Riyadh has a huge camel market. Prince Salman, former governor of Riyadh and now crown prince and minister of interior, has been trying to move the camel market outside of the boundaries of Riyadh municipality. And he cannot do it. So, why? Because Bedouin are powerful. They have ties. In this society, very, very, complex within the structures of the society. I mean, they're proud. They're not to be. Shouldn't the Bedouin of Saudi of Egypt would say they are not like Fellaheen. Of course, this is an ethnic slur, but anyway, thank you very much.
I have several questions. I'm sure that all of you do too. You have all touched on a number of different things, so I'm going to kind of throw you a curveball. The one question that, I hope it's not too much of a curveball, that no one has touched upon. So all of your researches document in great detail the permutations in mobile pastoral or Bedouin lifestyles due to, in large part, the oil boom of the 1970s, but starting also earlier with multinational oil exploitation, state-sponsored settlement schemes, and other national and international development projects. Bedouin, in other words, were not or never immune to or protected from the large-scale socioeconomic changes that so transformed the Middle East, and especially the Arabian Peninsula. Now, in the past 2 years, many of us have been witnessing and trying to get a grasp on the current reshaping of the political landscape of the region. What can you tell us about the ways in which Bedouin communities have been involved in and affected by the recent Arab uprisings in places like Egypt, Syria, and Oman? And do you think the so-called Arab Spring has had or will have an impact on Bedouin communities and identities?
Can I ask all panelists to be very brief in their answer, because we wanted to give an opportunity to all the other folks here.
Coming from Egypt, where we have been involved in the so-called spring, a month ago I was in Mersa Matruh and with talking to some friends from the Awlad Ali Bedouin, and I asked them, how do you feel about things here that's going on? They said, nothing very much has happened here, no big change. The only thing that is really good is that the Amn al-Markazi is gone. The central police have disappeared totally from Egypt, more or less, and we don't have police anywhere. So, but that they are gone, and therefore we run things ourselves. What they want is something they wanted for a long time, is that the muhafiz, that the governorate, be made up of people from the local community, from their town, not a governor sent in from the central government as usually they were. So what they're looking for, hoping for, is some kind of more decentralized control over their own areas and their communities. I would say this is one of the main political things that's going on.
I'll be very brief, but I'll just say a little bit about Syria, and then I'll say a little bit about Oman. In Syria, the last 2 years have been particularly interesting because the Bedouin in Syria, some of whom are, I will say, part of the Aneza Confederation, former camel herders, and others are more local shepherding, like the Mawali, the Haddadin. Those who are more local and part of the shepherding community were very much a part of the internal security. So I'll leave you to guess what they have been doing for the last year. However, the leader of the Al-Hassana, which is very closely linked with the Saudi royal family, a family that fought against the French mandate and then also was very successful in winning seats into parliament. The leader of the Al-Hassana published a manifesto in April of last year demanding greater freedoms and siding with the opposition, if I can put it that way. Oman has been much more quiet. Oman is always very delicate in everything that it does. What's quite interesting is that I was mentioning to somebody else that the youth in the desert who now have been educated, have reached the point where they have high school education. Some of them are working in the police and the army and so on, but many are unemployed. But the youth have used this opportunity to force the hand of the oil contractors and some of the subcontractors to negotiate with them for more opportunities in learning English and computer sciences and also in learning the skills necessary for the oil industry. They see their future employment very much being part in the area. So I'm very encouraged that the people themselves have actually taken part in an area of the peninsula where you wouldn't have expected it.
I will also say something very brief. With regard to the Bedouin of Syria, actually since the advent of oil in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and neighboring oil states, there has been a gradual migration from the Aneza tribal groups that lived in Syria for the last 3 centuries or so. And what's happening nowadays, that at least I know from northeast of Syria, because they have land, because they also relate to it as their homeland, but their sons have migrated to Saudi Arabia and they got naturalized. So also many of their sheikhly families, leaders, also moved to Saudi Arabia and settled there. So you have hundreds and hundreds of Bedouin families that have the elderly in Syria and the young generations in Saudi Arabia. And they have 2 dual nationalities. And of course, as my friends just said, with education and the changing world they live in, they all have gotten nowadays professional jobs. Many of the Syrian Bedouin who migrated to Saudi Arabia worked in the Al-Haras al-Watani, the National Guard, and also as personal guards for the sheikhs and the emirs of Saudi Arabia. With regard to what's happening in the Gulf region at large, I have personal fieldwork experience or anthropological experience on the situation in Kuwait and UAE. The Bedouin, even though they are adapting and changing to the world that they are living in, they view themselves as the backbone of the existing political structure as the defenders of the state. No wonder that the largest number of their young men work in the army and police forces. And they actually have that perception that they are the closest, they are the core of the system. And I think this is also found in in Qatar and in the Emirates. But with regard to education and geographical and professional and psychic mobility, many of them are moving in all kind of avenues and jobs, and the Sheikhli family that was dominant in northeast of Syria, their sons are now all professionals and studied in America, and in fact a couple of them lecture in Amman. They got in universities. So this is what's happening nowadays to them.
Wonderful. Thank you.
This is working. To what extent does the field of cultural anthropology usually focus on ethnic and exotic people?
I think there certainly has been a tradition, both in cultural anthropology and social anthropology, if I can talk about the American tradition and the British tradition, to look for the other in order to better understand themselves. So there's always been the tradition to go out and study a people who are different from yourself in order to, as I said, to understand yourself better and others. But that's changing. I think that's changing. The field, anthropologists do field work. In the past, the young student was sent off who knows where for a year to 18 months. He had to spend time to learn the language. As my own advisors had said, the first 3 months, any notes you take, you might as well throw away because they're all playing games with you anyway. And until you understand enough of the culture to recognize when your leg is being pulled, that's when you start actually taking notes. That's changed. I think, there are anthropologists who work in the car industry, who work in various organizations. There's an anthropology of organizations. There are all kinds of anthropologies. In that way, sociology and anthropology have begun to mix their fields, but it's the tools that are different, because the anthropologist still today, I would say one of the most important tools for the anthropologist is what some of my students call deep hanging out. Be there, listen, talk, ask questions. Of course, all of this participant observation is extremely important, but of course now, if you don't write it down, it isn't material, it isn't data. So you've got to then spend half the night writing up what you've been doing in the field. Yes, anthropologists have been very focused on ethnic groups. In fact, somehow tribes and tribalism became unfashionable in what I'll call the postmodern period. And so, we talked about African tribes, then we stopped talking about African tribes, and you could only talk about ethnicities. I never stopped talking about tribes, but I had a very interesting student from South Sudan, and he was reading all this stuff about ethnicities, and he kept on saying, I'm Dinka, I'm not an ethnic, I'm a tribe, So yes, it's a way of identifying yourself as different from others. We're all ethnicities, or in some ways you could say we're all parts of tribes.
If I can just also, with regards to what you said, when I went to Saudi Arabia, I specifically did not want to do my research amongst the Bedouin or amongst the tribal sort of people, because they were exotic, and I thought there was no particular, I wanted to do research amongst a sedentary community in central Najd and so forth, which was be much more sort of the majority population there. However, because there was a settlement project that was going on, the government was interested in settling, and I was interested in development and so forth. And so they asked me if, instead of going to this particular urban community, which was probably politically more complicated, if I would do this research, which would benefit them in a development project oriented towards this community. So I don't think that that's looking at them as an exotic So I didn't talk about the development project because later on, when they developed the project, they decided that they had spent too much money on the project to give it to Bedouin. And so they gave it to a company that was closely tied to the son of the king.
I have a question about the poetry. How was it written? Was it written at all? Was it in the classical Arabic or in the dialect, like poetry in the desert?
No, the people that I was with were totally illiterate. Nobody could read or write. And it was poetry was oral poetry. And it was not in classical, not in Fusha. It was in a special kind of language that is typical of that poetry. I mean, it was I understood the spoken language of ordinary everyday speech, but the poetry that it was in another language which was not Fusha and not Amiya, but it was a special.
Thank you very much for your insightful and very interesting lecture. My question is like this for all of you. What kind of research methods did you use other than the traditional observation, interview things? Did you use statistical analysis, for example? And what kind of implications do you think your studies will be for the Bedouins themselves and for the larger communities? Thank you very much.
Research methodologies?
Okay. Well, as we've indicated here, the most common methodology in anthropology is qualitative. I would say perhaps in the last 15 years it's also become participatory, so that instead of setting up our own topic guides for the areas that we want discussed, sometimes we're turning the table and looking to see what the community, how the community perceives certain broad conceptual issues. Sampling is always difficult. In my later study in Oman, I had 20 families. It's about 250 people out of a population of 5,000. Statistically, that's not a very large number. But then anthropology is, relies on rich ethnographic detail. I recently conducted a study in Lebanon where our sample was based on 120 surveys followed up by interviews and focus group and then in-depth discussion. This was obviously a health-based study, which therefore having the socioeconomic survey to use with the qualitative interviewing was very important. And now there is computer software that really helps with that. There's NVivo that can bring in some of the Access and Excel spreadsheets from surveys together with your large narratives. So there is some work in the quantitative field, but that isn't the strength of anthropology.
Sorry.
Thank you for the question. Anthropological research relies heavily on fieldwork methods. Having said that, it's the nature of the topic that you are doing will lead you to rely on participant observation, on interviews, on life history approach, on group discussions. It's really the particular research problem that direct you to what sort of qualitative data you want to get. But anthropologists usually, the fact that they are in the field for a very long time, usually from 1 to 2 years, because they have to learn the language and so on, they actually, through participant observation, living observation, they get a lot of data in depth. The number of people is not so much relevant because you study something small in depth to arrive at general statements. Studies in small, but really the research topic that determines exactly what tools, strategies you utilize in the field.
So my question regards the relationship between Bedou and sedentary people or Hadr like I come from Yemen, and I know there Bedouin and Hadar don't have a very nice relationship. Like the Bedou, for example, refer to the Hadar as, oh, these sedentary people, they live in houses, and vice versa. That works for, like, the Hadar would say, look at these Bedou who don't have any houses. And like you said, Bedou were not that like, they were well off. They were not hungry for the most part, or and I can imagine that Hadar were also the same. So I was trying to figure out what the reason for that relationship is, and yeah.
Well, yes, the difference between the Badia and the Hadar, is and the conflict between them and so forth is goes back to the earliest days of the Middle East and the history of the farmers versus the herders. In the United States, the people who were the cattle people hated the farmers because the farmers came and fenced the land and took it away from them, and the differences between the so-called freedom of the cattle people and these other farmers who were sort of, things. I think that's exaggerated. Yes, there were differences. Certainly, the knowledge of the people that I've, the knowledge that the Bedouin had was a specialist knowledge of a certain aspect of the ecology and of the economy, and of certain attitudes and so forth that went along with that. The sedentary people within the same country, within the same, whether it's Yemen or Najd or Asir or wherever, they have different ecological knowledge. The Bedouin didn't know about farming. For at least the ones that I was with, the Al-Murra Bedouin, farming was, let somebody could plant a palm tree for you there, and it would grow, inshallah, and that would be it. But certainly this is a very important aspect. You have to see the totality. The Middle East, the Arab world is not, only about Bedouin. It is also about the Hadar. It's about camel herders and sheep herders and farmers and fisher people and transporters, and very complex division of labor with skills traditionally in all of those different sort of varieties.
I'll add just a note to that. It's particularly true in northern Arabia, perhaps not as much so in Oman, but the self-identifying as Bedouin, certainly in these last few decades, what you find is there are people who have settled. Beirut, the Masalih district, is made up of Bedouin who were formerly herding, but they don't anymore. They're the people who are involved in the meat, in the sale of meat. There are Bedouin in the Baqa who are now involved in a great deal of agriculture with a little bit of herding, and then there are Bedouin who are more fully involved in herding. So they all self-identify as Bedouin, and in fact I am talking now of a particular tribe, of which there are elements in the city and in the agricultural area and in the countryside. And certainly since the time of independence, or actually since the end of the late Ottoman Empire, the leadership, the leading families of the important Bedouin tribes have had urban residences. So they've been, and their retinue. They have the important district of Damascus, of Aleppo, of Homs and Hama, belong to the elite who are urbanized.
I think it's also about the lack of knowledge of the other. And because if you're a Bedouin, you know your world. You don't know about the other. The Fellah doesn't like the Bedouin because they come in and ruin their crops and so forth and so on. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure we are all very, very thankful for this extremely interesting discussion, and we learned a lot tonight about Bedouin life as it was, and perhaps some aspects about their future. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the panel tonight.